Another day is here, and you're ready for it. What to wear? Check. Breakfast, lunch, and dinner? Check. Planning for what's next and how to save for it? That's where Bank of America can help. For your financial to-dos, Bank of America has experts ready to help get you closer to your goals. Get started at one of our local financial centers or 24/7 in our mobile banking app. Find a location near you at bankofamerica.com/talktous. What would you like the power to do? Mobile banking requires downloading the app and is only available for select devices. Message and data rates may apply. Bank of America NA, member FDIC.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. With the price of just about everything going up during inflation, we thought we'd bring our prices down. So to help us, we brought in a reverse auctioneer, which is apparently a thing.
Mint Mobile Unlimited Premium Wireless. How to get 30, 30, how to get 30, how to get 20, 20, 20, how to get 20, 20, how to get 15, 15, 15, 15, just $15 a month? Sold!
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 up front for 3 months plus taxes and fees. Promo rate for new customers for limited time. Unlimited more than 40 gigabytes per month. Slows full terms at mintmobile.com.
Hello, and thank you for listening to The History of World War II podcast, episode 481, Victory in Itself to Death. With the war as big as the one on the Eastern Front, it will come as no surprise that the decisions made were replete with irony. One of them being, as Kiev fell to the invaders and it was now time to press on to Moscow before winter proper set in, Army Group Center, having loaned out panzers to the other two groups, would now receive help from them in order to take Moscow, the hopefully last part of forcing Soviet Russia out of the war. Specifically, Hoppner's Panzer Group 4 would leave Army Group North, and Panzer Group 2, currently helping put an end to Kiev's resistance, would come north. These two, combined with Hoth's Panzer Group 3, would give von Bock what he needed to encircle Moscow in a ring of steel. But first, the road to Moscow had to be opened, and the taking of the city Vyazma, just over 100 miles or 160 kilometers west of Moscow, went a long way to making that happen. The city, of about 60,000 people, was captured on October 7, 1941, in which the Soviet 16th, 19th, 20th, and 24th Armies were also surrounded. Most of these Soviet forces would never fight for Russia again, but the civilians suffered as well. By the time the Nazis were forced out of the city in March of 1943, the city's population went from 60,000 to 716 souls. The rest, Jews, political prisoners, political officers, and POWs, were exterminated by the two concentration camps set up nearby. In all, about 80,000 people would disappear into mass graves in this area. Point is, the Battle of Vyazma not only lost the Russians 4 armies, but the invaders were now about 160 kilometers or 100 miles from Moscow. This war seemed destined to end by winter. However, the numbers, at this time, of the two combatants were thus: 1.2 million for the Germans and 800,000 Russian defenders. Now, this went against Wehrmacht doctrine that said you needed a ratio of 3-1 to give the attackers a realistic chance of success, and at the moment, the current ratio was 8 Germans to 5 Russians. But Berlin was banking on the fact, well, at least a fact to them, that Stalin had practically no other young men to call on. Besides, the invaders had both tactical and operational excellence on their side, sharpened by the fighting since taking Poland. Their ability to fight versus the Russians' ability to defend would soon make the ratios null and void, and Moscow would fall. Another advantage on the battlefield was surprise, but it can be easily argued that though the panzers were coming at Moscow from the northeast at Kalinin and from the south near Tula, they were both now held up, and that surprise was now gone. This forced the Germans to fall back on their professionalism. And yet, if the invaders had had the time to read captured Soviet documents, they would have found that Soviet analysts, putting aside their over 1 million lost men so far, were attempting to figure out how and why they were losing most of the time, and then, of course, how to alter their fighting as to not lose. One document gave credit where credit was due to the Germans. It said, in part, use of infantry forces strongly supported by heavy-caliber infantry guns and anti-tank weapons, with motorcycle troops and the application of deeply echeloned panzer attacks in close cooperation with the Luftwaffe, had considerable impact, thereby deceiving the intent of eventual encirclement, and with good fire control while on the move. And it's certainly conceivable that the Poles, the French, Norwegians, or Greeks would have worked out a counter to the Blitzkrieg had their resistance lasted longer. Well, here in the East, the contest was being dragged out, and the Soviets were learning. Another Soviet report spoke of the Germans' main weakness, that being their infantry was being left behind by their panzers, or that the Germans were not good night fighters. And this nugget, though costly it was, allowed the Russians to harass the invaders at night with small attack groups or obsolete bombers, many flown by women. The result? While the invaders took out entire Russian armies, the Soviets were pin-pricking the enemy during the nights, to the point that, in time, German professionalism could not be supported as it was in battles past. Here's one example of the Germans at night. In late September, one German supply driver expressed his shock of what his days and nights were like now, being 100 kilometers inside the Russian territory. He wrote, "Transporting munitions, we are under fire all day, from 5 a.m. until 7 p.m. It was a real pleasure," sarcastically, "with whistling bullets and exploding shells. One man was killed and 8 wounded in our ammunition column. It is forbidden to drive at night," he explained, "because there are too many ambushes." On one particular night, Mutterlus, that was his last name, was sitting next to the driver, and he described his greatest fear. "Our primary concern was the vehicle ahead of us, whose taillights were not functioning. Hans sat far forward, hunched over the steering wheel, his eyes drilling through the darkness. Then it got so bad that Mutterlus himself climbed out onto the running board to guide the driver. But then the truck ahead stopped. Mutterlus screamed, 'Halt!' But it was too late. Their truck smashed into the rear of the truck ahead, sending Mutterlus into the air. Behind them was an SS column, but knowing there was a good chance that enemy partisans were out there nearby, those trucks of the SS went wide of the accident and kept going. So much for comradeship. Next morning, Mutterlus's truck got a tow into a nearby village, but just as they rolled in, they were set upon by a Soviet force that had been trapped behind the lines by the fast-moving panzers. Before too long, another German unit came into town to work on their own malfunctioning trucks, and they were able to drive off the attackers. But by the time it was all over, Mutterlus's truck was completely devoured by fire, now unable to offer up its parts so that other trucks could continue on. But going back to the element of surprise, turns out that, like most things, is a two-way street. As Axis forces moved ever closer to Moscow, the commanding officers made predictions about supplies, based on how long it would take each of them to reach the outskirts of Russia's largest city. And in those reports, the estimates of Russian strength kept rising. 171 divisions was the Germans' guess about the Russians as Barbarossa got underway. Then 200 divisions was put up just before Kiev was taken. And then it was adjusted again up to 360 divisions. It was the invaders' turn to be surprised. But surely that had to be it. There was no one else for Stalin to call on, right? As touching these emerging German problems, General Franz Halder, the Chief of Staff of the OKH, or Army High Command, noted in his diary as early as August that time factors favors them, as they are near their own resources, while we are moving further and further from ours. Halder also noted that while the various German fronts were wide, they could not be deep, which allowed the Russians to get in behind their front lines, but not to attack those very forces, no, but to hamper their supply lines. In the end, that is, the end of the German offensive towards Moscow, it would come down to supplies, or the lack thereof. But for now, at the moment, November 1941, as there had been no German defeats, these weaknesses were more theoretical than real. But as Stalin was about to launch his own offensive against Army Group Center, these shortcomings would be brought to the fore. We have already seen Operation Typhoon, the attack on Moscow, ground to a halt by the end of November. But that is not what allowed Stalin to go over on the offensive, this time with more confidence, mixed with desperation. Quite simply, forces from the east were arriving, which resulted in, by December 5th, the Russians having 1/3 more rifle divisions, 5 times more cavalry divisions, double the artillery regiments, and 2.5 times the number of tank brigades than they did on October 2nd. So while the Germans were losing panzers due to a lack of parts, and the infantry was not receiving winter clothing, the defenders, they were stronger than ever. And lastly, Stalin was starting to turn over control of more and more forces to Zhukov, away from the Stavka. Thus, Zhukov's chief of staff, Lieutenant General V.D. Volkolovsky, got to work. First was to determine how many men each side had, approximately. Volkolovsky's guess was 1.7 million for the invaders and 1.1 for the defenders. However, that number for the Germans, that also represented their rear elements. In other words, the Germans were not as strong as they had been in actual up-front fighters. And 2, the reason the Russians counted the rear elements as well, they were factoring those in for their pushback or destruction. Stalin was most uneasy at having German troops so close to the capital. That must come to an end. Continuing the estimate of forces, both sides had about the same number of artillery and mortars, about 13,500, and roughly the same number of tanks to panzers, about 1,170. But it was the air arm that the Russians clearly dominated, with 1,370 craft of all kinds, to the Germans' 600 planes. And as it was early December, the ground around Moscow had frozen enough so the Soviet fighters and bombers had several airfields in the area to choose from. Despite Stalin's nerves being on edge, Zhukov knew he could not simply push the Germans back on all fronts. He did not have the wherewithal for that. Besides, the Germans, though exhausted and with limited supplies, were still lethal adversaries. It was still possible for them to eat up entire armies, and Zhukov had no intention of feeding that beast. No, instead of cutting off the arms trying to encircle Moscow, Zhukov would first focus on pulling back the fingers attached to the hands themselves, attached to the arms around Moscow, one thing at a time. First, to the north of Moscow, by December 5th, the German front line up there was due north of the western edge of Moscow. To counter this, a part of the Soviet First Shock Army was to head west and make for Klin, about 15 miles or 24 kilometers behind this current German line. They would engage the Panzer Group III and the German Ninth Army. But the First Shock Army would be supported by the 13th and 20th Armies. Hopefully they would be able to drive these enemy units west enough to once again open the rail line in this area that connected Moscow with Leningrad, or at least get it closer to that beleaguered city. But over-engineering this attack, on purpose, Zhukov would have the First Shock Army and the 13th Army come at Klin from the west to keep the enemy honest. Meanwhile, the 20th Army, supported by the 16th Army, would also attack Klin, but from the south. Between these two axes, the Germans of Panzer Group III and the 9th Army would be driven away from Moscow. And if Stalin got everything he wanted on his Christmas list, these enemy units would be pushed back all the way to Volokholamsk, about 60 miles or 96 kilometers west of Moscow's western border. As for the pain that Guderian was being in the south, actually located a bit east of Moscow, he and his would be attacked by the 50th and 10th Armies. They were to push the Germans due west, but Zhukov gave special orders not to allow the KG Guderian enough time to dig in or regroup. The last thing Zhukov wanted or needed was to have Guderian and his panzers to become a tick in Moscow's southern area, something the invaders could hang their hats on and plan another attack from. No, they were to be all pushed back as well. Zhukov, and this was rare, was bluntly honest with Stalin. He said this may not work, but he and the Stavka felt that the invaders were tired, so perhaps this would work. And if success was to come, whether it was due to German fatigue versus Soviet military professionalism, well, the result would be the same. On the other side of the battle line, the tone was quite different. Here, there was no hesitant hope for victory. Instead, it was frozen dread. Army Group Center Commander von Bock noted on December 3rd, "If the attack is called off, then going over to the defensive will be very difficult." This was matched by the Gruppen 3 commander telling von Bock, "Our offensive strength is gone." And General von Kluge, commander of the 4th Army, told von Bock that Hauptner's Panzer Group 4 should not go ahead with their attack. And lastly, but on the same day, Guderian radioed in that he advised his 2nd Panzer Army to call off the operation, that the minus 30 degrees Celsius was making fighting impossible, and even moving was cumbersome. 1st Panzer Commander Grappa added to Guderian's experience by reporting the turrets of his panzers would not move, the optics had messed it up, that machine guns could only fire single rounds, and it took 2 or 3 crew members to depress tank gun barrels, only achievable if they stamped down on the main barrel. What followed these messages were reports of 1st and 2nd degree frostbite. 1st degree is superficial skin damage, but pain is generated by the touch of cloth. 2nd degree is where the skin develops blisters and the skin hardens. When one recovers, there is a chance of cold sensitivity lasting for a while, and it was only early December, the beginning of winter. These issues were not of morale or believing in their own superiority. They were factual. These were real-world issues that could not be overcome with a better attitude. Not with what Army Group Center had to hand, or didn't have. As such, as much as he did not want to, von Bock ordered his units to go over to the defensive. He had little faith in this gesture. After all, the entirety of their plan was to attack, and to keep attacking until Moscow was entered. There the men would find relief from the cold. But that had not happened. Still, what was a commander to do? On December 4th, the temperatures went down to minus 25 degrees Celsius. On the 5th, they were at minus 35 degrees Celsius. And the next day, they went down a few more degrees. The forces about to launch themselves against the Axis forces around Moscow had only been together for about 2 or 3 weeks. There were survivors, burned-out veterans, of course, from all those trapped pockets, but mixed in with them were fresh Siberian units, trained militia, and reservists. As there were so many men, they all did not have guns, certainly no ammunition, and many of the leading men, the officers and NCOs, were equally inexperienced. Those that had experience, well, many of them were now dead. But what they all had, was appropriate clothing. Thus none were experiencing frostbite. And lastly, they were more motivated than the Germans. Their path was clear. Oh, and one last point. The Germans did not know of their existence. Not that it mattered if they did. The Germans were in no position to move out and attack. They were dug in, and the men only thought of shelter and warmth. Surely, with the conditions being what they were, in the early morning hours of December 5th, the Soviet 29th Army moved out across the frozen Volga River, just west of Kalinin. The 29th soon hit the German 9th Army line and kept going. The Germans weren't caught off guard so much as simply overwhelmed. Proving this, the Russians, would drive 10 kilometers or 6 miles behind the line before being stopped that day. As this drive was taken as a good sign, the next morning, December 6th, the Soviet West and Southwest fronts were ordered to launch their attacks. Now, the Soviets were not impervious to the conditions. Snowdrifts and the freezing temperatures had delayed their buildup and their attack, but ironically, even this would be to their advantage. Their piecemeal attacks, normally something that benefited the defenders as they only had to deal with a part of the attackers at one time, ended up causing an offensive that only grew in intensity as each unit got into the fray. Meanwhile, the men of the 2nd Battalion of the Schutzen Regiment 114 of the 6th Panzer Division were about to get a most unwanted message. The battalion was immediately east of the Volga-Moscow Canal line, at which the Soviets were coming. As one man of the German unit wrote in his diary, during the course of the morning, there were signs of unrest among the civilian population. The explanation that our town would be taken by the Russians and that the Germans would leave. This was laughed at by the German soldiers. Still, someone had the presence of mind to contact the 7th Panzer further east and were told that the 7th was on its way back to the battalion's location. But no reason was given. The men of the battalion were confused, but by 10 a.m., General Walter Model, the 9th Army's commander himself, showed up at the 6th Panzer Division HQ and told all that Panzer Group 3 did not have the strength to hold back whatever had attacked them out there. But clearly the enemy had found, once again, fresh troops. Model issued orders in quick succession. He mentioned the rear area, clearing the route there, what to do with the wounded, and to activate all support services. It slowly dawned on the men. General Model was ordering the first retreat of his corps, the first retreat of the war in the East. Greetings, everyone, from Central Virginia. So I just want to say hi to a couple people. Some people have donated, some people have become members, and I got a couple of nice emails. So anyways, let's see here. As far as the latest members, Robert Lupercio from Elk Grove, California. Thank you very much, Robert. Jeffrey Moon made a very nice donation. Thank you very much, Jeffrey. And I would like to say hi to a certain John T. of Central Illinois, who turns people onto the show as they are on his or in his transportation vehicle. So thank you very much, John. And I would like to say hi to Mel Iizuka, I'm sure I'm saying that wrong, who is a third-generation Japanese American. Both of his parents were interned at Potsdam, Arizona. And of course, like I covered during the episodes, they lost everything when they were put into the camp. They tried to, like most people after horrible events, simply get on with their lives. So Mel, thank you very much for writing to me. I did write you back. And yeah, that was a tough thing to read. You know, you like to think the best of your country, of your people. And when something like that happens, you just have to be honest with yourself. Anyway, that's enough of that. So now that we're back, we're going to see what happens with Stalin's counteroffensive around Moscow. Take care, everyone.